Today is November 9th, 2015. We're on the campus of the University of Georgia here in Athens, Georgia. My name is Robert Pratt. I am a professor of history at UGA. My guest this afternoon is the award-winning author, Mr. Taylor Branch, who earlier today was inducted into the Georgia Writers Hall of Fame. Congratulations to you, Mr. Branch, on that worthy accomplishment. And thank you so much for sitting down with me this afternoon to do this interview.
Thank you.
Just have a few questions for you and get a sense of your thinking on these subjects. Let's begin with sort of the basic question. When did you first know that you wanted to be a writer?
I didn't know that I wanted to be a writer really until I'd already written a lot and had it published. I knew by the late 1960s that I was deeply caught up with the questions of what was going on in the 1960s in politics and the religious and the political questions that the civil rights movement raised. That kind of came over me. I dropped my pre-med courses. I was in pre-med in college and dropped them because the power of that movement forced me to change my life's interests against my will, but I didn't know how I wanted to be involved. I wanted to study it. I thought about being a professor of the issues involved. I thought about being a political activist. And I stumbled into writing in journalism, and by about 1970, I said, that writing about these fundamental issues may be a way to develop my interest. And quite frankly, what I really said was, I'll at least write in journalism until I make up my mind what I want to do when I grow up, whether I want to be a professor or I want to be a political activist. And then writing just grew on me. So it was not for 6 years until I wrote my first book and said, okay, I've backed into this career, but my political interests, my interest in the civil rights era are driving my interest, and now the best way that I can see to attack it is through writing.
You've had a very distinguished career as a writer. You have written in so many different capacities. You've served as the editor of the Washington Monthly and Harper's Magazine, served also as Washington Affairs columnist for Esquire Magazine. You have written on college sports. You have written on President Bill Clinton. So you have tackled so many varied topics. But I think it's fair to say that you're going to be best remembered for your trilogy on Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., his life, his works, which you've titled America in the King Years. The 3 volumes that you have contributed that have so importantly contributed to the way we understand civil rights history. I'm wondering, what was it in your early life that influenced your decision to become a journalist, in which you would pretty much dedicate your life, so much of it, to chronicling those very important civil rights years?
Well, I think that it was intensely personal for me. I wanted to know where this movement had come from, because the movement was right out of the heart of Atlanta where I was growing up. Dr. King was living and working there, but I never even saw him in the flesh. And yet the movement that he was involved in made fools and hypocrites out of people that were my friends who tried to explain it but were scared of it. It just had such a big effect that you could see and that you could feel. And people were afraid of it, but the questions went so deep. And eventually I kept saying, this must be pretty profound if it's raising all these questions. And I mean a wide range of them. For example, one of them was music. My friends in high school, I'm talking about 1960. In 1960, I'm just entering high school. All of them would not think of courting their girlfriends to anything but, I guess the whitest singers was Johnny Mathis. But otherwise, it was all the Tams and the Temptations and the Drifters and Benny King and Sam Cooke and Jackie Wilson, and people would sneak down to hear Ray Charles at Herndon Stadium. And it seemed to me that there was something very profound going on here in music, that while we were being raised to think that we were going to run the world and wear neckties, that we really felt that black people had the keys to the human emotions, and that's why these songs were so popular. I mean, how can this be? You know, so music, and politics, and the fact that Dr. King was preaching sermons that went so deep in people. There was so much passion in his voice, and by contrast, the sermons that you heard in regular white churches were so defensive and full of platitudes on that same subject that pretty soon I was worn down. I said, there's something more profound going on here than there is in my own life, and I want to know where it came from. So, and I read everything I could about the civil rights movement because I knew it had already affected me just to be interested in it. And my impression was that everything was very analytical, that it was full of analysis about who was militant and who was radical and who was this, that, and the other, who had an economic approach. And to me, it didn't have any of the feel of the movement, of the things that would hit you in the gut when you saw a photograph of a small girl marching into dogs and fire hoses and something like that. The books seemed very arid, and so I became devoted to the notion that what you really needed was a narrative history that tried to get inside the lives of the people that in that great panorama, you know, on all sides. And so my first rule was I don't want to use any labels and I don't want to use any analysis. I want to try to find stories that can bring this alive and can help me feel where it came from, because that was a personal quest for me.
Earlier today in your comments, you said something that resonated with me. You said that so many of the people who claim to have been involved in the civil rights movement or on the front lines are not being truthful because it was dangerous business. In your own capacity as a journalist and the work that you've done, obviously you've been on the front lines, close to the front lines. You've seen a lot of this stuff up close. Can you describe for us what it was really like for those of us who are sort of too young to remember what it was like to be a civil rights activist in the 1950s, 1960s, whether you were black, whether you were white, regardless? If you were actively trying to promote racial and social change in this country during that time, what was it really like to be involved in that campaign?
Well, that's a good question. I really think that you could form a generalization that fear is the first thing that black people and white people shared, because that crossed the lines before understanding, before common vocabulary or anything. You were risking not just your hide or getting beaten up and everything, but you were risking your reputation, your future, your capacity. You know, it's remarkable to me that so many of the sit-in students, the leaders of the sit-ins and the freedom rides, were first from their family to go to college, and their whole family was invested in the future that they could make into the middle class, and they were putting it all at risk by going to sit-ins. With an arrest on their records, they could be thrown out of schools. A lot of the administrators and presidents of black state schools were under the thumb of the governors and that sort of thing, and they expelled their own students. So there was fear of getting beaten, there was fear of losing your life, but there was also fear of losing your reputation, you know, your friends. Everything was indirect, particularly for white people. Every white person said, it's not me, I don't want to not allow black people in here, but it might hurt my father's business or my friend's father's business. It's always one step removed, it's not really me. So everybody was reacting to this series of broad, radiating fears and apprehensions, and they were very powerful. Diane Nash, one of my favorite people from this era, told me years later that looking back on it, every day in the movement when they're arguing about what to do reminded her of her wedding day. In one specific sense, she said, on my wedding day my knees were shaking because I knew I was taking a big step and I didn't know how it was going to turn out, but I knew it was going to define my life. I'm making a commitment. I'm stepping into the unknown in a very important way. And she said the movement was like that because you were doing something that gave you pause, that you knew was going to define you. You could wind up being injured, or it could grow. And of course, that's what she later said, that when you step out there and take risks, if the movement grows, it's the greatest reward you can have.
I think most of us seem to think at least that we have a pretty good idea of the risks involved for Black African Americans who were involved in this campaign. People like Ann Moody, of course, have chronicled this very powerfully in her memoir, Coming of Age in Mississippi. Can you give us a sense of what it was like for white activists to take that bold and courageous step? I often tell my students that whites who dedicated themselves to the civil rights movement in many respects paid a heavier price than blacks because they were often viewed as race traitors.
Mm-hmm.
They were often singled out as targets. Many of the black freedom riders say that it was the white activists who actually caught the brunt of the beating in many instances. So it was no easy walk for white activists who took that step.
There weren't as many, but there's more than most people are aware of, males and females. I think that it was hard. Bob Zellner, for example, horribly beaten on the freedom rides. Interviewing him about how it affected his later life, some of them are remarkably have a great aplomb. He said, basically, I think you can overestimate it. He said, I just realized how rare it is for people, because he did it out of Christian faith. He was religiously motivated. A lot of them were. It's not all political motivation or moral motivation. It was religious. He said, I just realized how rare it is for people to take our faith seriously. Our faith seriously, that we really believe that in God's love for all fellow human creatures, and so why wouldn't we do something like this? And he said, I got the tar beaten out of me for doing that, and people asked me why I would do it as though it was crazy, and to me it was just, I take these beliefs seriously, and I'm glad I did it. He weathered it. A lot of people didn't. Some people, golly Moses, Dennis Sweeney, who murdered Al Lowenstein, from the time he got involved in the civil rights movement as a Freedom Summer volunteer, when he got beaten, he descended into conspiracy theories about what was going on until, there were people who came out of it with mental illness. It's like a battle. It's like post-traumatic stress disorder. And it affected Ann Moody. It affected people in both races.
Exactly. Ann Moody became a virtual recluse for the rest of her adult life, and she was sort of in and out of hiding. Passed away early this year.
And El Ponder, another one like that, out of SCLC. There were a lot of people who suffered, and who still carry it. It is like going into a war, and Stokely was going in and out of jail for 6 years before he said Black Power, and he said that he had the scars as well.
We think of martyrs as somebody who give their life for a cause, but I often tell my students there are many martyrs in the civil rights movement who did not necessarily die or were not necessarily killed as a direct consequence of their involvement. People like Ann Moody and some of the others who carry the mental scars, the psychological trauma, the nervous breakdowns that they had to endure through all of those turbulent years. Your work, your trilogy of King pretty much spans the whole civil rights movement. I wonder if you could think of maybe one defining moment. There were several major campaigns, but maybe one defining moment or maybe a couple of defining moments in the civil rights movement, because I think one of the mistakes that historians often make is that we sort of date the movement beginning in 1954-55, when there was so much stuff that took place earlier that we sort of look at Brown versus Board of Education in 54, the Montgomery bus boycott in '55, Emmett Till's lynching a few months earlier in that summer of '55. So many things took place in a very short period of time. I wonder if you think there were any defining moments either before that period or after that period that you think would like to focus on.
That's a huge question. I think there are a lot of defining moments before. I mean, just so that we won't spend the whole day on this, I will say that the entire reaction at the end of the Civil War, the next 10 years, is a defining moment because it showed how willing the United States was to go through a searing experience of progress on race relations, to go through a civil war and end slavery. But within 10 years, we were busily forgetting the lessons of what we did, such that I grew up being taught that the Civil War had nothing to do with slavery, 80 years later.
Course.
So how we remember things, and we passed three civil rights amendments to the Constitution, and within 20 years we made all three of them dead letters. So that I grew up with people just saying, well, don't worry about the 15th Amendment, it says black people can vote. And it was passed explicitly to settle that question, and here we were, 90 years later, and it was almost impossible to vote in some of the southern states. So there were many key moments. The one lesson that shows is that race relations is not a constant march forward. There's nothing inevitable about it. We've gone backwards and forwards. And the modern civil rights era, it is fair, so we've been involved in these things throughout our history. I don't think that it's that inaccurate to say that the Brown decision is a convenient marker for a modern surge forward, because you've got 8 white justices saying that all these accommodations that we've been making are not compatible with our Constitution. That was like a clarion call. Now, of course, it didn't really change anything, at least instantly, and but it did give people it did give people pause to say the Supreme Court has said we've swallowed our own example, and that this is incompatible with our Constitution. What are we going to do about it? And the movement grew up to test it. And there were a lot of great moments in the movement. To me, I always go to the children's marches in Birmingham in May of '63, because I think that was the emotional breakthrough for a lot of people who had been saying segregation may be wrong, but time will heal it, or we need to get different politicians, or I'm going to write a letter about it, or I'm going to be doing something later, or it's somebody else's problem. But when that happened, I think there were millions of Americans said, I'm going to do something about it. It broke down their emotional resistance, and quite frankly, it's very telling to me, if I'm right that was an emotional turning point, that none of the political commentators at the time said this is going to change. This is the fulcrum of politics. This is going to change, put the civil rights movement on the map. We don't know how politics is going to react to it, but the way it did actually was that it turned all the Southern Democrats into Republicans and changed the partisan structure of politics, showing how powerful race is. But nobody's really analyzed why what happened to those children in Birmingham could have that effect. And I think it's because it's too embarrassing that our political structure turned on the witness of school children because the adults were not willing to grapple with the questions as forthrightly as those children.
Interesting. You have obviously had an opportunity to meet many of the people who were actively involved in the civil rights movement, many of whom we know and many of whom we do not know. Who would you say, of those that you've had an opportunity to meet and to know over the years, it need not necessarily be just one person, maybe a couple that you would consider to be the most interesting figures that you've ever encountered?
Wow. Well, I've already mentioned Diane Nash.
Yes.
I would mention Bob Moses, who's still alive, the father of Freedom Summer, a whole different leadership model in contrast to Martin Luther King, of grassroots. We need a lot of leaders, not one overriding leader who tells us what to do. Bob Moses of SNCC. I dedicated Parting the Waters to Septima Clark, because being around her had an enormous impact on me, just watching the way she worked. But I had this rule about that I was telling narrative stories. I wasn't writing an essay about who was important, and I couldn't, she was always off screen, so I couldn't put her in the story in proportion to the impact that I felt she had. So the only thing I could think of was to dedicate the book to her, because she had had a big impact on me. But she was always off teaching people how to read, and in citizenship school she was off stage, so I couldn't bring her on stage in the books. But she was a very influential person too.
Yeah, wonderful people, all of them. You begin the first in your trilogy, Parting the Waters, with a chapter on Vernon Johns that you entitled Forerunner. What made you decide to open up that book with this chapter on Vernon Johns? Somebody that up until that time, I would say that quite a few people probably never heard of.
Well, actually, Vernon Johns was the answer to another dilemma of how to start, to me, how to get readers involved in going inside something as vast as the civil rights movement. I felt, after doing my research, that you had to have some grounding in how the black church worked, the relationship between the preachers and the deacons, because the churches were going to be the laboratory for the movement and the mass meetings. And they substituted for a lot of institutions that white culture took for granted. They were the newspaper, the bank, the theater, the entertainment, the Congress, the strategy session, and everything was all taking place in the church. But I had this rule that I wasn't going to write any essays. I wasn't going to use labels. So I was stuck. I didn't know how to begin the book because I was not going to start with an essay. Dear reader, here's some generalities about how the black church works that's different from how your church might work or anybody else's church. And I stumbled into awareness of this guy, Vernon Johns. I mean, I knew that he had been Dr. King's predecessor, but I had no sense of his personality until I got some clues from Ralph Abernathy accidentally. And it turned out to me that it was the answer to a riddle, that I could tell the story of this person, Vernon Johns, and communicate what people needed to know through his story about how the black church worked, and including how Dr. King's church worked, and how a preacher like that could be driven out of his own congregation, showed some of the dynamics in there. And so to me, it was an answer to the riddle of how do I start a story that necessarily needs to communicate reality that incubated in the black church without an essay on the black church. So telling his story was the answer to that. But I can tell you, when I turned it in, my publisher had a heart attack. American readers are not big on race histories, and you have going for you that they like Martin Luther King, and why do you turn in a first chapter that doesn't even mention Martin Luther King and is about this character nobody's ever heard of? So it was a big gamble, but to me it was worth it because it was a storytelling way to take people into the emotions and the drama of the black church.
I think it was ideal. I think it's one of the better things about that very fine book. Anytime historians begin any project of research, they always go into these projects with certain preconceived notions. I'm certain that you knew a lot about civil rights movement when you start writing it, but somewhere along the way there is something in the research, in the discovery that surprises us. I'm wondering if you had any of those surprise moments. In all the years that you've devoted to chronicling civil rights history, is there anything that has surprised you most about what you discovered in the course of your research?
Wow. Well,
something that you really didn't expect to find.
Well, I think they're big surprises, great and small. I never even knew that Dr. King's name wasn't Martin Luther King. and to discover why and how that grew out of the odyssey of his father's life was a big surprise. So I never thought when I started that I would get in the second book into the depths of the inner life of Malcolm X and his struggle with Elijah Muhammad. I didn't plan to do that, but it was probably some of the most difficult research I did. But I'm pleased to have done it, because I think Malcolm is still a very, very misunderstood figure, and I think he took his religion a lot more seriously than most people take it in him. He's now become like a virility symbol or something like that, which is Bob Moses was part of my proposal. I knew enough about the civil rights movement to say this is going to be not just a biography of Dr. King. I want to go into people like Bob Moses. But his depth surprised me. The Bobby Kennedy research surprised me. The depravity of Hoover was more than I expected. I learned a lot about Dr. King's flaws, but I came out respecting him more than I did when I went in, because quite frankly, I will confess, I patronized him to some degree. I thought his nonviolence might be just an exaggerated version of Baptist, turn the other cheek, and that he got carried away with it. He was, like Malcolm, was much more profound in understanding the contradictions within Islam and what he was doing. Dr. King was much more profound in facing these decisions about his doubts in religion and how to fit them together into a program as a political leader. So I came out respecting him a lot more, particularly after the Nobel Prize. I mean, I guess if I had to say, and this may be too abstract for you, but I mean for general readers or viewers, but from the time he got the Nobel Prize, before that, in some senses, he was a conventional character. He was trying to lift the concerns of the civil rights movement up so that Americans would pay attention to them, the way they did in Birmingham when he sent those kids there. They paid attention to him. And he was trying to get audiences with the president. He was trying to speak. He was trying to get meetings with the president, to get into the White House. And in that sense, you're like a conventional leader. But when he got to the Nobel Prize ceremony and said, "I've been to the mountaintop, but the valley calls me," the whole rest of his career was dragging his staff into things that they didn't want to do. They wanted to celebrate the Civil Rights Act for about 20 years of chicken dinners and Oslo celebrations and so on and so forth. And he said, "No, we're going to Selma, not in a year. We're going to Selma." He was January 2nd, 65, 2 weeks after he gets back from the Nobel. He's dragging the staff down there. They didn't want to go. And then he's dragging them to the north, and they didn't want to go. He said, "We have to go make a witness and show that the race issue is not and never has been purely Southern. It's always, we have to show them that." And then he dragged them into the Vietnam conflict. All of his advisors were against it, and he dragged them into the Poor People's Campaign. So I think that there was the thematic big surprise for me was the prophetic impulse in him that took over for the last part of his career to do things that were not going to capture the country's attention, but it may capture history looking back on it, that this was the right kind of prophetic thing for him to do.
Great. So much has been written on the civil rights history. It's become, one of those defining episodes in our nation's history and in our collective conscious. Great biographies have been produced, great histories as yours, spanning time periods. For younger scholars who have this abiding interest in civil rights history and who think that they may want to make a contribution to the literature, what do you see as being sort of the next great subjects that need to be explored? Are there some unknown personalities out there that we need more
From this period.
From this period that we
Wow.
need more attention on? Are there some episodes, some lesser known campaigns that perhaps have not gotten the attention that they need? What's the next great frontier for enterprising students who want to do civil rights history?
I don't know about great frontiers because but because a lot has been fleshed out, you know, in books about small things, and I think that's good. But there's never been a really good book on the St. Augustine campaign, and St. Augustine is really important. It's really overlooked. In some ways, it was the most violent place Dr. King was, full of irony because the Klan there, because it's a Catholic culture. It wasn't the Klan. It was the Klan wouldn't have them because they were Catholic, so they became the Ancient City Gun Club, and it was like a Catholic version of the Klan, but they were incredibly violent in the summer of '64. But it was overshadowed by the fact that it was at the Freedom Summer was starting in Mississippi, and the Civil Rights Act was being passed, so it was lost. I think some of the other things, Dr. King was deeply involved in Vatican II that's going on at the same time in which the Catholic Church is trying to deal with whether its deicide teachings made it complicit in the Holocaust and in Nazism, which are very profound questions. And the ecumenicism of Dr. King, that he was involved with people like Abraham Heschel, are not well known. You know, they're ecumenical subjects that I think people could raise up. There are lots of little books about, about Viola Liuzzo, about various martyrs, and people. Stokely's story, there have been 2 or 3 books about Stokely, but I think Stokely still flummoxes people because they want to make him Che Guevara. Or they want to make him some kind of. He was a transitional figure. I think what he did in Lowndes County, the year that he spent in Lowndes County from March of 1965 through May of 1966, that's 14 months, is one of the most amazing periods of civil rights service. And he went into it, and when he came out of it, he had worked miracles, but he was very impatient that the United States, that nobody was paying any attention to what happened. And and he became like a shooting star of fame, but I don't know that he ever settled. When I was interviewing him, I don't think he was always sure that what he was doing is right, but he never found something that could take hold anymore. His Pan-Africanism and the various other things that he did never satisfied him.
Yeah. You come to know Bill Clinton very well. You two go way back. You have a very lengthy history together, and you have written on him and done a memoir. What was that like? How would you describe your relationship with President Clinton and his wife Hillary?
It was truly an amazing experience. It's probably the biggest professional disappointment in my life, the memoir that I wrote of that, because all the reviews politicized it. They said that I was either kiss and tell and telling personal stories about, what his wife was like when she was in cold cream and that sort of thing, or that it was trying to defend or whitewash Monica Lewinsky. It wasn't either one. What made it so compelling for me was that this president that I had known reinitiated contact after 20 years and said simply, will the records, I've read the footnotes of your civil rights history, and so many of them came out of presidential libraries. Do you think that my administration is going to collect records that are vivid enough that would allow people when we're dead to be able to do what you're doing? And I was so impressed that he was thinking about that. This was even before he took office. This is president-elect. And the oral history grew out of that because my answer was, I said, certainly I'll talk to your people about what kind of records you're going to keep. They're going to keep. And I went back to him and said, it's a disaster. They don't like notes. If they do keep them, they're going to take them home to write their own books. You're not going to tape record your conversations like Johnson did, which is the greatest historical resource, but it's already extinct because presidents aren't taping anymore. And so the oral history developed, we settled on it as our best remedial method that we could do to try to get him to put down as much as he could what he couldn't say then, that he wanted people to know when he was dead, but that he couldn't say publicly. And that's what it was. It was an exercise in what it's like to be president. And for me, the memoir that I wrote about it was, it's difficult to write a two-person narrative when one is yourself and the other is the President of the United States. It's almost impossible to balance that, but I wanted to try to give readers a sense of what it was like for me, because I'm trying to promote this and get him to put stuff on the record. But then he asked me for advice. Well, what do I do? Do I say, I'm sorry, I'm not here to give you advice, I'm here to put it on the record? Then he might shut off the project, you know. So my own roles were, and we'd be trying to talk history, and Chelsea would come in and say, Daddy, will you time me on my take-home exam? And then he'd say, well, I'm trying to talk to Taylor about whether we should send cruise missiles into Baghdad. So it was quite an experience to try to give. It was an adventure. Not always fun. I felt under pressure a lot of times. Am I doing the right thing? Am I asking? I wanted to ask questions that would get the most candor, short of having him say, you know, that's it for you. So it was a very difficult role, but it was quite amazing.
Very good. Mr. Branch, this has been wonderful. I'm very grateful for the opportunity to have spent some time with you and asking some of these questions. Thank you so much for your time, and congratulations again on your great honor as having been inducted into the Georgia Writers Hall of Fame.
Thank you, Dr. Pratt. I enjoyed talking with you.